I'm Rachel, 32, and nothing prepared me for watching my father throw my grandmother Eleanor out of her own home during the worst storm in decades. The same $1.6 million house she'd raised him in. The same woman who sacrificed everything for him. But what happened at her reading left everyone speechless, including me. Some lessons about family and betrayal cut deep. But Grandma Eleanor had one final move that changed everything. Before I begin this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever witnessed family betrayal that taught you about what truly matters. Growing up, my grandmother Eleanor's house was my sanctuary. A stunning Victorian with wraparound porches, ornate woodwork, and gardens that bloomed from March through October. Built in 1897. The house had been in our family for 4 generations and had weathered many storms, both literal and figurative. Over the years, its value had climbed to $1.6 million, though to Eleanor, it was simply home. My earliest memories revolve around Grandma Eleanor. After my grandfather passed away from a sudden heart attack, she never remarried. Instead, she poured all her love into raising my father, Gregory, and later into being the grandmother I needed. When I was 5, she taught me to bake snickerdoodles in her spacious kitchen with the antique copper pots hanging overhead. 8. She helped me build a reading nook in the window seat where sunshine streamed in through stained glass panels. By 12, we spent weekends restoring furniture together in her garage. Me learning patience as she taught me to sand wood until it felt smooth as a baby's cheek. Family is everything, Rachel, she would say, her hands gentle but firm as they guided mine. This house isn't just wood and plaster. It's memories, it's legacy, it's love. Eleanor had sacrificed so much for my father. After becoming a widow at just 37, she took on 2 jobs to put Gregory through college. She worked as a school librarian by day and did bookkeeping for local businesses on evenings and weekends. She never complained, even when she had to sell her beloved piano to cover his graduate school application fees. Your father was so bright, she once told me. All that potential needed nurturing. That's what mothers do. My mother Diana entered the picture when Dad was finishing his MBA. They met at a university function, and according to family lore, he was immediately smitten by her intelligence and drive. Mom was studying law, and Grandma Eleanor initially loved having another educated woman in the family. They bonded over books and gardening, with Eleanor teaching Diana all her family recipes and gardening secrets. For years, everything seemed perfect. Dad's investment consulting business took off. Mom established herself at a prestigious law firm, and I came along, followed by my siblings Michael and Jessica. We spent holidays, birthdays, and random Sunday afternoons at Grandma's house. The dining room table that seated 12 was often full, with Eleanor presiding at the head, beaming at her growing family. But around the time I turned 16, subtle shifts began. Dad's visits to Grandma became shorter. His phone would ring during family dinners and he'd step away for lengthy calls. His designer clothes and luxury watches became talking points at gatherings. Mom started mentioning appearances and the importance of projecting success. Your father works hard, she'd say whenever I questioned their new lifestyle. He deserves the finer things. Grandma never criticized, but I caught her concerned glances when Dad mentioned his latest investments or real estate ventures. Once, when I helped her clear dishes after a particularly tense dinner where Dad had boasted about a risky business move, she simply said, "There's a difference between growing wealth and chasing it. Rachel, one builds, the other consumes." At 18, I left for college but came home regularly to visit Grandma. Our bond remained strong even as the family dynamics shifted. She supported my decision to study social work rather than business or law, unlike my parents who considered it wasting my potential. Helping others is never a waste, Eleanor assured me. Some wealth can't be measured in dollars. By the time I graduated and started my career at a nonprofit supporting domestic violence survivors, the family gatherings had become uncomfortable affairs. Dad dominated conversations with talk of acquisitions and deals. Mom interjected with stories of her high-profile cases. Michael followed Dad's footsteps into finance while Jessica pursued marketing. I often felt like the family outlier with my modest salary and apartment. But Grandma Eleanor always made me feel valued. "You have your grandfather's heart," she'd whisper, squeezing my hand under the table. It was during a Thanksgiving dinner in my 28th year that I first noticed Dad eyeing the house differently. as Eleanor excused herself to check on the pie. He ran his hand along the dining room wainscoting and commented, "They don't build them like this anymore. This place must be worth a fortune now." Mom nodded approvingly. "The neighborhood has certainly gentrified. The location alone adds significant value." Something in their tone made me uncomfortable. They weren't admiring the craftsmanship or acknowledging the home's sentimental worth. They were appraising it. Over the next year, Dad began mentioning estate planning and tax liability whenever he visited Eleanor. He brought articles about elderly people losing their homes to predatory tax assessments. He introduced her to financial advisors who were colleagues of his. All the while, I noticed his own lifestyle becoming increasingly lavish despite no apparent growth in his business. When I questioned Mom about Dad's sudden interest in Grandma's financial affairs, she became defensive. "Your father is protecting his mother's interests," she insisted. "Estate planning is complex. You wouldn't understand with your limited financial background." But something felt wrong. Very wrong. And my instincts about people, honed through years of working with vulnerable clients, were screaming at me to pay attention. The first concrete sign of trouble came on a rainy April afternoon. I'd stopped by Grandma Eleanor's house with soup and fresh bread, our tradition whenever one of us felt under the weather. She'd called that morning, her voice tight, just asking if I might visit. That alone was unusual for my fiercely independent grandmother. When I arrived, I found her sitting in her favorite armchair by the bay window, staring out at the rain. Her normally immaculate silver hair was slightly disheveled, and she hadn't changed out of her robe despite it being past noon. "Grandma?" I placed the soup container on the coffee table and knelt beside her. "What's wrong?" She turned to me, her blue eyes clouded with confusion and hurt. "Your father was here this morning." "Oh?" I kept my tone neutral, though my stomach instantly knotted. "He brought papers." "Many papers." She gestured vaguely toward her roll-top desk where I could see a stack of documents. "He says I need to sign the house over to him to protect it from estate taxes. That I could lose everything if I don't." My heart sank. "Did you sign anything?" "No." Eleanor straightened slightly. "I told him I needed to think about it. He didn't like that." I squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing, Grandma. He's never spoken to me that way before, Rachel." Her voice quavered. Like I was being foolish for questioning him. Like I was being difficult. That evening I called my father, struggling to keep my voice level as I asked about his visit to Grandma's. "It's complicated, Rachel," he said dismissively. "Mom is getting older, and we need to protect her assets. The house should be in my name for liability reasons." She seemed upset by how you presented it. She misunderstood. His tone hardened. "Look, I'm trying to handle this properly. Don't go filling her head with doubts just because you don't understand finance. I understand enough to know that. Your mother and I have discussed this at length," he cut in. "We're doing what's best for everyone. Stay out of it, Rachel." When I tried discussing my concerns with Mom, she was equally dismissive. "Your father knows what he's doing," Diana said. "Eleanor is getting forgetful. Last week she couldn't even remember where she put her checkbook. That doesn't mean she's incapable of making decisions about her home," I argued. "We're not having this conversation." Mom's attorney voice emerged, clipped and final. "This is between your father and your grandmother." But it wasn't just between them anymore. Not when I could see the toll it was taking on Eleanor. Over the next few weeks, Grandma's health began to show signs of strain. She developed insomnia and lost weight. When I suggested she talk to her doctor, she waved me off. "It's just stress, dear. It will pass." Meanwhile, Dad intensified his campaign. Twice I arrived at Grandma's to find real estate agents wandering through the house, measuring spaces and discussing potential, while Eleanor sat bewildered in the kitchen. "Your father arranged it," she explained, "just to get an updated valuation for insurance purposes." But I knew better. Especially after I overheard one agent on the phone saying, "Mr. Wilson wants to know how quickly it could be market-ready after the transfer." Through a former college friend who now worked at Dad's firm, I learned the disturbing truth. Gregory Wilson was in financial trouble. Serious trouble. His successful investment firm had been making increasingly risky bets over the past 5 years, and many had failed spectacularly. He'd leveraged personal assets, taken out massive loans, and was now facing potential bankruptcy if he couldn't find a substantial cash infusion. The family home, Grandma Eleanor's beloved house, was his target for salvation. The situation exploded during a family dinner at Eleanor's. Dad arrived with Mom and my siblings, all dressed like they were heading to a business meeting rather than a family meal. Halfway through dinner, Dad cleared his throat and raised his glass. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, smiling broadly. "Mom has generously agreed to transfer the house to me as part of our estate planning. It's all settled." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "What? Gregory, I haven't agreed to anything." Dad's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "Now, Mom, we discussed this. The papers are being finalized. It's the sensible thing to do." "I told you I needed more time to think," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "I haven't signed anything." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Michael and Jessica exchanged glances. Mom studied her wineglass intently. "It's just a formality," Dad continued smoothly. "You'll still live here, of course. Nothing changes except the name on the deed. For tax purposes." I couldn't stay silent. "That's not true. Ownership matters legally. Grandma, don't sign anything without independent legal advice." Dad's face flushed with anger. "Stay out of this, Rachel. You have no idea what you're talking about." "I think she does," Eleanor said quietly. "And I think we need to end this discussion for tonight." The remainder of the dinner was excruciating. Dad alternated between forced joviality and tense silence. Mom attempted to smooth things over with inane questions about the food. My siblings avoided eye contact with everyone. As they were leaving, I overheard Dad in the foyer, his voice low but intense. "Mom, this delay is causing problems. I've already made arrangements based on our discussion." "What arrangements?" Eleanor asked. Dad didn't answer. He just kissed her cheek stiffly and walked out. When they'd gone, Eleanor sank into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. "He's in trouble, isn't he?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think so, Grandma." She closed her eyes briefly. "I always taught him that honesty matters most. That family doesn't lie to family." When she looked at me again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What happened to my boy, Rachel?" I had no answer for her. Only a growing sense of dread about what would come next. The family dinner confrontation marked a turning point. Dad realized his direct approach had failed, so he switched tactics. Instead of pressuring Eleanor directly, he began a subtle campaign to undermine her in the eyes of the family and their social circle. It started with casual comments at family gatherings. Mom got confused about which day it was again. He'd say with exaggerated concern, "Or I had to help Mom with the bills, she was trying to pay the same one twice." Then came the evidence he shared with family members. Eleanor's checkbook with occasional arithmetic errors highlighted in red pen. A wall calendar where she'd mistakenly written a doctor's appointment on the wrong date. A burned pot on her stove that he claimed showed she was becoming forgetful about cooking. Small isolated incidents that happened to everyone were presented as symptoms of cognitive decline. And people began to believe him. "I'm worried about Grandma," my brother Michael confided in me over coffee. "Dad says she almost set the kitchen on fire last month." "That's not true," I countered. "She burned a pot of soup when the phone rang." "It happens." Michael shrugged. "Dad thinks we should consider assisted living options just to be safe. He's been researching places." My sister Jessica was similarly convinced. "Dad found her wandering in the yard at night in her robe," she told me. "She said she was looking for her cat, but she hasn't had a cat in years." "She was probably looking for the neighbor's cat that visits her," I explained, frustration mounting. Snowball comes by almost every evening. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Even our extended family began treating Eleanor differently, speaking louder and slower, exchanging concerned glances when she occasionally misplaced her glasses or struggled to recall a name. I knew I needed evidence to counter Dad's claims. I spent a weekend with Eleanor observing her closely. She managed her medications without confusion, prepared meals safely, handled her finances competently, and engaged in complex conversations about current events and books she was reading. When I suggested we visit her doctor together for a cognitive assessment, she readily agreed. "I know what your father is implying," she said matter-of-factly as we drove to the appointment. "Let's put it to rest. Dear." Martinez had been Eleanor's physician for over 20 years. After thorough testing, his conclusion was unequivocal. Mrs. Wilson shows normal cognitive function for her age. There are no concerns about her ability to make decisions or live independently. He provided a written statement to that effect, which Eleanor kept in her purse. Just in case, she said with a sad smile. But Dad had already moved on to his next strategy: isolation. He began scheduling family events that excluded Eleanor due to concerns about her stamina. He suggested to her friends that they limit visits because too much stimulation confuses her. He even persuaded her church circle to remove her from the volunteer rotation for her own good. Your grandmother needs consistency and calm, he told everyone, positioning himself as the concerned son. I watched in horror as Eleanor's social world contracted. Her phone rang less frequently. Fewer visitors knocked on her door. Even her weekly bridge club suddenly found reasons why she shouldn't host anymore. Then I discovered something truly disturbing. While helping Eleanor search for a missing tax document, I found unopened bank statements and bills tucked behind books on her shelf. These are from the last 3 months, I said, confused. Why haven't you opened them? Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. I never received those. Are you sure they came to the house? Further investigation revealed that Dad had somehow arranged for Eleanor's mail to be diverted. Important financial and legal documents were being intercepted before she could see them. When confronted, he claimed he was helping organize her affairs and that she had agreed to the arrangement, something Eleanor vehemently denied. Despite the mounting evidence of manipulation, Eleanor remained reluctant to directly accuse her son of malicious intent. He's under pressure, she would say. Gregory has always wanted to succeed so badly. Maybe he thinks he's protecting me in his own way. Her generosity of spirit only made Dad's actions more reprehensible in my eyes. But it also made Eleanor vulnerable to his next move. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Dad arrived at Eleanor's with a notary and a thick envelope of documents. Just some routine updates to your will and property documents, he explained cheerfully. Nothing complicated. The notary is here to make it all official. Eleanor, who had been caught off guard by the unexpected visit, called me in a panic after they left. I signed papers, Rachel, she said, her voice trembling. Many papers. He kept pointing to signature lines and talking about protecting the house from creditors. It all happened so fast. I rushed over immediately. Do you have copies of what you signed? He said they'd mail them once everything was processed. My stomach dropped. Grandma, what exactly did he say the documents were for? A living trust. I think. He said it would protect the house while allowing me to live in it for the rest of my life. She twisted her wedding ring anxiously. But when I asked to read through everything first, he said there wasn't time because the notary had another appointment. He seemed so insistent, and I just signed where he pointed. The devastation came 3 days later when Eleanor received a certified letter. It wasn't the copies of documents she'd been promised but a notice of transfer of deed. The house now legally belonged to Gregory Wilson. There was no mention of a living trust, no guaranteed lifetime residence, nothing protecting Eleanor's interests. She had signed over her home based on deliberate misrepresentations. I found her sitting at her kitchen table, the letter spread before her, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. He lied to me, she whispered. My own son. That evening I confronted my father at his office. I wanted neutral territory, away from Mom's influence and without the risk of other family members intervening. You tricked Grandma into signing over her house, I said without preamble as I walked into his plush corner office. You deliberately misled her about what those documents were. Dad barely looked up from his computer. She knew what she was signing. No, she didn't. You told her it was a living trust that would protect her right to stay in the house. You lied. Now he did look up, his expression cold. I did what was necessary for this family. For yourself, you mean? I know about the business losses, Dad. I know about the loans. Something flickered in his eyes, surprised perhaps that I'd discovered his financial troubles. But it quickly hardened into defiance. You know nothing about business, Rachel. Sometimes tough decisions have to be made. The house is an asset that was sitting idle. It's not an asset. It's Grandma's home. It's a piece of real estate that will now be properly leveraged. He leaned back in his leather chair. Mom will be fine. I've told her she can stay until I find a buyer. I'm even helping her look for a nice little apartment. The casual cruelty of it stunned me. How can you do this to her? After everything she sacrificed for you. Spare me the emotional manipulation, he snapped. This is business. The house is now mine legally. End of discussion. When I told Mom what had happened, expecting her moral compass as an attorney to be outraged, I was shocked by her response. Your father did what he had to do, she said. Though she couldn't quite meet my eyes. Eleanor is elderly. The house was too much for her anyway. He obtained her signature through fraud, Mom. That's elder abuse. It's illegal. A flash of discomfort crossed her face before her professional mask returned. That would be very difficult to prove in court. Gregory says Eleanor understood what she was signing. And you believe him? Over Grandma? Her silence was answer enough. Somewhere along the way, my mother had chosen her comfortable lifestyle over her integrity. It was a devastating realization. That night, I sat with Eleanor at her kitchen table, a table that technically no longer belonged to her, and helped her contact an attorney. But the news wasn't good. Fighting the transfer would mean a lengthy legal battle, one that would pit Eleanor against her own son in court. The emotional toll would be enormous and success wasn't guaranteed. I don't have the strength for that kind of fight, Eleanor admitted, her voice tired but resolute. But I won't forget this and I won't let it stand. There was something in her tone, a quiet determination that gave me hope. Grandma Eleanor had been underestimated her entire life, first as a young widow, then as an aging woman. Perhaps my father's biggest mistake was forgetting that beneath her gentle exterior was a will of iron. Part 5, The Storm and Abandonment. Summer gave way to fall. And with the changing leaves came Gregory's increasingly brazen plans for Eleanor's house, now legally his house. He hired architects who paraded through the rooms, discussing walls to be removed and spaces to be modernized, all while Eleanor was present. The kitchen needs a complete gut renovation, one designer said loudly. As if Eleanor wasn't sitting right there at her own table. These old cabinets are charming but completely outdated. These outdated cabinets were handcrafted by my husband. Eleanor responded quietly, but no one seemed to hear her. Gregory had promised Eleanor could stay until he found a buyer. But his timeline rapidly accelerated when a potential purchaser expressed interest. A developer who wanted to convert the historic home into luxury condominiums. It's a perfect opportunity, Dad announced during an unexpected visit in early October. But they want to begin work immediately. You'll need to be out by the end of the month. Eleanor was stunned. That's 3 weeks away. Gregory, where am I supposed to go on such short notice? I've found some nice senior apartments across town, he replied, sliding a glossy brochure across the table. Very modern. Lots of amenities. I was present for this conversation and couldn't believe what I was hearing. Those apartments have a 2-year waiting list, Dad. I checked when we were exploring options before. He waved off my concern. I made some calls. Pulled some strings. There might be a unit available soon. Might be. Eleanor's voice was steady despite her pale face. You want me to leave my home of 50 years for a might be? Dad checked his watch impatiently. Look, the market is hot right now. This developer is offering well above asking price. But they won't wait. Start packing, Mom. I'll help you sort through what to keep and what to donate. The callousness of treating his mother's treasured possessions as items to be casually discarded was breathtaking. But worse was yet to come. 2 days later. While I was helping Eleanor begin the heartbreaking process of sorting through decades of memories, a weather alert came across my phone. A major storm system was developing offshore. Forecasters were predicting it could be the worst in decades, with potential for flooding, power outages, and significant damage. We should pause this, I told Eleanor, showing her the alert. The storm's expected to hit in 3 days. Let's focus on storm preparations instead. Eleanor nodded, visibly relieved to have even a temporary reprieve from dismantling her life. The next morning, however, Gregory arrived with 3 moving men and a stack of empty boxes. Change of plans, he announced, striding into the living room where Eleanor and I were having tea. The developer wants to inspect the empty house before the storm hits. You need to be out by tomorrow. Tomorrow? Eleanor's teacup clattered against its saucer. That's impossible. And with the storm coming. I've arranged movers, Gregory cut in. They'll pack everything today. You can stay in a hotel until your apartment is ready. What apartment? I demanded. You said it was a might-be situation just 2 days ago. Gregory's jaw tightened. The situation is fluid. The important thing is getting the house emptied immediately. No, Eleanor said, rising to her feet. Though petite, she suddenly seemed to fill the room with her presence. I will not be rushed out of my home like this. Not with a dangerous storm approaching. The developer can wait until next week. For a moment, father and grandmother stared at each other, decades of complicated history crackling between them. Then Gregory turned to the movers waiting awkwardly in the doorway. Start upstairs, he ordered. Pack everything. If she won't cooperate, we'll do this without her input. What followed was one of the most distressing days of my life. The movers, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to lose their payment, began systematically emptying Eleanor's home while she watched in stunned disbelief. I called my siblings for support, but both made excuses about prior commitments. I called my mother, who promised to talk to your father but never showed up. By evening, most of Eleanor's possessions had been packed into unmarked boxes or loaded directly into a storage unit Gregory had rented. The movers left with promises to return early the next morning for the remaining items. You can't stay here tonight, Gregory informed Eleanor as he prepared to leave. The utilities are being transferred tomorrow. I've booked you a hotel room. He tossed a key card on the now empty dining room table. Gregory, Eleanor's voice was soft but unwavering. This is still legally my residence. You promised I could stay until the sale was final. Plans change, he replied coldly. Be out by 9 tomorrow. After he left, Eleanor collapsed into the single remaining chair, her face ashen. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered. Not like this. You're coming home with me, I said firmly. Tonight. We'll deal with the rest after the storm passes. Eleanor looked around at the half-emptied shell of her beloved home and nodded slowly. There's nothing left for me here anyway. We packed a suitcase with her essential items and medications. As we prepared to leave, Eleanor asked for a moment alone to say goodbye to the house. I waited on the porch, giving her the privacy she deserved for this painful farewell. When we arrived at my modest one-bedroom apartment, I insisted Eleanor take the bedroom while I would sleep on the couch. She was too exhausted to argue. As I made up the bed with fresh sheets, I noticed how small and fragile she suddenly looked, sitting on the edge of my sofa. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of her son's betrayal. The next morning I had to work. My nonprofit couldn't spare me during a major client crisis, so I made Eleanor comfortable with books, tea, and the TV remote before reluctantly leaving. I called to check on her during my lunch break. I'm fine, dear, she assured me, though her voice lacked its usual vigor. The weather is getting worse. Please be careful coming home. By mid-afternoon, the storm had intensified dramatically. Wind howled through the city streets, and rain came down in blinding sheets. My director closed the office early, urging everyone to get home safely before conditions deteriorated further. I fought through flooded streets and down tree limbs to reach my apartment, increasingly worried about Eleanor. When I finally arrived, soaked and windblown, I found her staring out the window at the raging storm, tears silently streaming down her face. I just saw on the news, she said without turning. My street is flooded. Water is coming into the lower floors of houses. She finally looked at me, her eyes reflecting a pain deeper than any physical suffering. He knew, Rachel. Gregory knew this storm was coming when he forced me out. He couldn't even wait until after it passed. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My father had prioritized a real estate deal over his mother's safety. If Eleanor had followed his plan and gone to the hotel, which was in a low-lying area now being evacuated, she might have been in serious danger. That evening, as the storm reached its peak, we lost power. By candlelight, I held Eleanor's hand as she alternated between devastating silence and quiet reminiscence about happier times in the house that was no longer hers. Your grandfather built that window seat for me when we first moved in, she recalled, her voice drifting through the darkness. He said every woman deserves a place to dream. The storm raged through the night and into the next day. Reports of extensive damage throughout the region flooded in as communications were gradually restored. Eleanor's neighborhood was particularly hard hit, with significant flooding and wind damage. When we were finally able to safely visit the house 3 days later, the sight was heartbreaking. Water had penetrated the first floor, damaging hardwood floors that had stood beautiful for over a century. Wind had torn off portions of the slate roof, allowing rain to soak into plaster ceilings. The garden Eleanor had tenderly cultivated for decades was a muddy ruin. Gregory was already there when we arrived, talking animatedly on his phone while surveying the damage. Yes. Complete renovation required now, he was saying. Actually, this might work in our favor. Insurance will cover the storm damage, and we can use that to offset some of the conversion costs. He barely acknowledged our presence with a curt nod before returning to his call. Eleanor stood silently in what had been her front parlor, water squishing beneath her boots, taking in the destruction of her home. But instead of the devastation I expected to see on her face, I was surprised to find a strange calm, almost a resignation. It's just the house now, she said softly. The home I knew is already gone. On the drive back to my apartment, Eleanor suffered a dizzy spell that frightened me enough to take her directly to the emergency room. Tests revealed her blood pressure was dangerously high, and the doctor admitted her for observation. Stress can have severe physical effects, especially at her age, the doctor told me privately. Has she experienced any significant life changes recently? I laughed bitterly. You could say that. Eleanor remained hospitalized for 3 days. During that time, neither Gregory nor Diana visited, despite my informing them of her condition. Michael called once to ask for updates but made excuses about work preventing him from coming. Only Jessica made a brief appearance, bringing flowers but staying less than 10 minutes before leaving, clearly uncomfortable. When Eleanor was discharged, she was noticeably frilier. The confident posture and quick step that had always made her seem younger than her years were diminished. The doctor prescribed medications for her blood pressure and recommended avoiding stressful situations, a prescription impossible to fill given her circumstances. The storm had changed everything, not just Eleanor's physical home but her place in the world. In the span of a week, she had gone from an independent homeowner with deep community roots to a displaced elder, dependent on her granddaughter's sofa bed and limited resources. But as I would soon learn, the storm had not broken Eleanor's spirit. It had merely forced her to channel it in a new direction. Finding suitable housing for Eleanor after the storm proved challenging. My one-bedroom apartment was too small for long-term sharing, particularly given her need for privacy and rest during recovery. The senior apartments Gregory had mentioned remained unavailable, with waiting lists now even longer due to storm displacement. Eventually, we located a small one-bedroom garden apartment about 20 minutes from my place. It was nothing like the gracious home she'd lost, but it had a tiny patio where she could place a few plants, and the landlord allowed month-to-month leasing, which gave us flexibility. Moving day was bittersweet. Eleanor had so few possessions left to arrange in her new space. Gregory had released some items from storage, primarily clothes and a few pieces of smaller furniture, but many treasured belongings remained inaccessible, locked away at his discretion. It's like starting over at 78, Eleanor remarked as we unpacked the meager contents of her life into the apartment. I never expected to begin again at this age. Despite my efforts to make the space homey, Eleanor never truly settled in. She went through the motions of daily living, keeping the apartment tidy, preparing simple meals, even planting geraniums in pots on her small patio, but the light had dimmed in her eyes. She lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her diminished frame. Her silver hair, once always perfectly coiffed, she now often left in a simple braid. Meanwhile, Gregory wasted no time capitalizing on his acquisition. The storm damage provided an insurance payout that he used to begin extensive renovations on the house. Rather than restoring its historic character, he gutted much of the interior to create a more contemporary open concept that would appeal to luxury buyers. Each time I drove past the house, now surrounded by construction equipment and dumpsters filled with century-old woodwork and fixtures, my heart broke anew for Eleanor. I stopped mentioning the renovations to her, but she knew. The neighborhood grapevine ensured she received regular updates on the destruction of her former home's character. He's erasing our family's history, she said once. The only time she directly commented on the renovations. As if none of it mattered. The family remained deeply divided. Michael and Jessica continued to support Gregory's version of events, that he had legally acquired the property and was making necessary improvements to an outdated house. They visited Eleanor occasionally but always briefly and with visible discomfort. Diana, to my surprise, began showing signs of doubt about her husband's actions. She called me one evening, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "How's your grandmother doing?" she asked. "How do you think she's doing?" I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "She lost everything." A long pause followed. "The renovations are extensive," Diana finally said. "Gregory is replacing almost everything, even features that weren't damaged by the storm. He's erasing her presence." I said, "That was always the plan." Another pause. "I didn't know it would happen like this," she admitted quietly. "The storm, the rush move, it wasn't supposed to be so traumatic." "What did you think would happen when you force an elderly woman from her home?" "I don't know." For the first time in my life, I heard my confident, articulate mother sound lost. It all made sense when Gregory explained it. The estate planning, the tax benefits, the investment opportunity. It seemed rational. There was nothing rational about it. It was calculated theft. Diana didn't argue. "Would Eleanor see me if I visited?" she asked instead. "I don't know. You could try." Diana did visit Eleanor the following week. I wasn't present for their conversation, but Eleanor later told me it had been clarifying. "Your mother is beginning to see your father clearly for the first time in decades," she said. "It's painful for her. We all construct narratives about the people we love, and when those narratives crumble, it's disorienting." Despite her own suffering, Eleanor still found capacity for compassion toward others, a quality that made her son's betrayal all the more cruel. About 2 months after the move, I noticed Eleanor becoming more organized and purposeful. She began keeping careful records of her medical appointments and expenses. She sorted through her remaining possessions with methodical precision. She made phone calls when I wasn't around, ending conversations abruptly if I entered the room. "Is everything okay?" I asked one evening after witnessing such a call. "Just tying up loose ends," she replied vaguely. At my age, it's important to have affairs in order. I worried she was planning for her death, perhaps even contemplating hastening it. But her next actions suggested a different purpose. One morning, she asked me to drive her to an address in the financial district. It turned out to be the office of Thomas Bradley, a well-respected elder law attorney I knew by reputation through my work. "You have an appointment?" I asked, surprised. "Yes." "Would you mind waiting? This is something I need to handle personally." Eleanor spent over 2 hours with Attorney Bradley while I waited in the reception area, increasingly curious and concerned. When she emerged, there was a new resolve in her bearing, a straightening of her shoulders I hadn't seen since before the storm. "What was that about?" I asked as we drove home. "Insurance," she replied cryptically. "Just making sure everything is protected." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor had several more meetings with Bradley and other professionals whose offices we visited, a financial advisor, an accountant, even a private investigator. She remained tight-lipped about these consultations, saying only that she was putting things in order. My concern shifted from worry about her mental health to curiosity about her plans. There was purpose behind her actions, a quiet determination that reminded me of the grandmother who had raised me. Whatever she was doing, it seemed to be restoring her spirit. My career suffered during this period as I devoted considerable time to supporting Eleanor. I took unpaid leave when possible and worked reduced hours, stretching my modest savings to cover the shortfall. My supervisor was understanding but eventually had to warn me about the sustainability of the situation. "Your work with survivors is valuable," she reminded me gently. "But you can't help others if you burn yourself out." I knew she was right but couldn't see an alternative. Eleanor needed me, and I would not abandon her as the rest of the family had done. The distance between Diana and Gregory grew increasingly apparent. She began calling me more frequently for updates on Eleanor, and occasionally visited without Gregory's knowledge. During one such visit, she confided that she had consulted with an attorney of her own. "I've spent 30 years building a career based on justice and ethical conduct," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "How did I not see what was happening in my own home?" Eleanor, overhearing this, responded with characteristic wisdom. "We are all vulnerable to blindness when it comes to those we love, Diana. The question is what we do when our eyes are finally opened." As fall turned to winter, Eleanor's health began to decline more rapidly. The combination of stress, displacement, and heartbreak took its physical toll. She developed a persistent cough that eventually led to pneumonia and a week-long hospitalization in January. During her hospital stay, Gregory visited once. Briefly, He stood awkwardly at the foot of her bed, declining to sit. The house renovations are almost complete, he reported, as if this were news Eleanor would welcome. The developer has increased their offer significantly. Eleanor regarded him with a gaze that was neither angry nor sad, but evaluating, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. I'm glad things are working out for you, Gregory, she said simply. He shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. Is there anything you need? From storage, perhaps? No, she replied. I have everything that matters. He left shortly after, visibly relieved to escape the weight of her quiet dignity. When Eleanor returned to her apartment, her decline continued. The pneumonia had weakened her, and her doctors expressed concern about her heart. I began staying overnight more frequently, sleeping on her small sofa to be nearby if she needed assistance. During these quiet evenings, Eleanor often reminisced about her life, her childhood in rural Massachusetts, meeting my grandfather at a USO dance during the war. Their early years in the house that was now being transformed beyond recognition. I've had a good life, Rachel, she told me one night as we sat together watching snow fall outside her window. Full of love mostly. That's more than many people get. You deserve better than what happened, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. She reached for my hand. Perhaps. But life isn't about getting what we deserve. It's about how we respond to what we're given. A small, mysterious smile played at the corners of her mouth. And I've always believed that justice finds its way in the end. There was something in her tone, a quiet confidence, that gave me pause. But before I could question her further, she changed the subject, asking about my work and whether I'd heard from a colleague I'd mentioned previously. In her final weeks, Eleanor seemed to find a peace that had eluded her since losing her home. She spent time writing in a journal, made phone calls to old friends, and even had me help her record video messages for family members, including Gregory. For after I'm gone, she explained when I questioned the purpose of the recordings, some things are better said with reflection and distance. I tried to discourage such talk, but Eleanor was pragmatic about her mortality. Death doesn't frighten me, Rachel. It's just another transition. What matters is how we live and what we leave behind. Not possessions, but principles. One morning in early March, I arrived at Eleanor's apartment to find her sitting in her armchair by the window, a thick envelope on her lap. She looked up as I entered, her expression serene. Perfect timing, she said. I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling today? I asked, noticing she seemed more energetic than she had in weeks. At peace, she replied. She patted the envelope. I've finalized everything. Thomas will handle the rest when the time comes. Thomas Bradley? The attorney. She nodded. I've made arrangements. After I'm gone, there will be a formal reading of my will. Everyone must attend in person, that's a condition for receiving any bequest. I started to protest that such matters could wait. But Eleanor raised a hand to stop me. It's all handled, dear. Now would you make us some tea? And perhaps we could play one last game of gin rummy? For old time's sake. We spent that day quietly together. Eleanor seemed to savor each moment. The taste of her tea, the cards in her hands, the sunlight streaming through the window. Looking back, I realized she knew her time was near. That night, I stayed later than usual, reluctant to leave as Eleanor seemed unusually reflective. As I finally prepared to depart, she took my hands in hers. You have been my greatest joy, Rachel, she said, her blue eyes bright and clear. Remember that love is the only thing worth holding on to. Everything else, houses, possessions, even grievances, we eventually must release. I hugged her tightly, suddenly afraid it might be the last time. I'll see you tomorrow, I promised. I'll be waiting. She replied with that same mysterious smile I'd noticed before. When I arrived the next morning, I found Eleanor in her bed, peaceful and still. She had passed away during the night. A journal open on her lap and a pen still loosely held in her hand. Her final written words at the top of an otherwise blank page read simply, "Justice comes in its own time." The grandmother who had loved me, guided me, and taught me about resilience had taken her final journey. But as I would soon discover, Eleanor Wilson had one last lesson to teach us all about justice, dignity, and the true meaning of legacy. Eleanor's passing, though not unexpected given her declining health, hit me with the force of physical pain. For several days, I moved through arrangements in a fog of grief, supported by colleagues from my nonprofit and a few of Eleanor's remaining friends. My mother called frequently, her voice thick with regret and sorrow. My siblings reached out with awkward condolences, clearly uncomfortable with both the loss and their role in the events leading to it. Gregory, however, responded to news of his mother's death with business-like efficiency. He took control of funeral arrangements, selecting the least expensive options despite my objections. The estate is limited, he explained curtly when I suggested a more fitting tribute. We need to be practical. I wanted to scream that the estate would have been substantial if he hadn't stolen his mother's home, but I held my tongue, not wanting to dishonor Eleanor's memory with an ugly scene. The funeral service was sparsely attended. Many of Eleanor's friends had drifted away after her forced relocation, and others were too elderly to attend. Gregory performed the role of grieving son with polished precision, accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity. Standing beside the casket, he delivered a eulogy that painted Eleanor as a devoted mother who had lived a full life but had become increasingly confused in her final years, subtly reinforcing his narrative about her mental decline. Listening to his sanitized version of Eleanor's life, which conveniently omitted his betrayal and her displacement, I dug my nails into my palms to keep from interrupting. This was not how my grandmother deserved to be remembered. But Eleanor herself had counseled patience in our final conversations. Truth has its moment, she had said. Sometimes we must wait for it. After the service, as family gathered at Gregory and Diana's home for a reception, I noticed my mother watching her husband with new eyes. The admiration that had characterized her gaze for decades had been replaced by something cooler, more assessing. She performed her duties as hostess perfectly, but there was a distance between them that hadn't existed before. My brother Michael cornered me by the drinks table, his expression troubled. Was Grandma really okay in that apartment? He asked quietly. Dad said she was happy there, but Jessica visited once and said it seemed inadequate. It was all she could afford after losing her home, I replied pointedly. Michael winced. Dad said the house transfer was her idea, for estate planning purposes. And you believe that? He's our father, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Why would he lie? Before I could answer, we were interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished older gentleman who introduced himself as Thomas Bradley, Eleanor's attorney. Gregory immediately moved to intercept him, hand outstretched. Mr. Bradley, thank you for coming. If you have any estate documents, you can give them to me. I'll handle my mother's affairs. Bradley shook Gregory's hand but maintained a professional distance. Actually, Mr. Wilson, I'm here to deliver formal notifications. Mrs. Eleanor Wilson left specific instructions regarding her will. He proceeded to hand each family member an identical envelope. Mine contained a formal letter explaining that Eleanor had requested a reading of her will at Bradley's office the following week. Attendance was mandatory for any beneficiary wishing to receive their inheritance. This is unnecessary, Gregory protested, skimming the letter with a frown. A simple distribution would suffice. Mrs. Wilson was quite explicit in her instructions, Bradley replied evenly. She wanted the family gathered together for the reading. It was her final wish. Of course we'll honor Mother's wishes, Diana interjected before Gregory could argue further. We'll all be there. After Bradley departed, Gregory dismissed the will reading as theatrical nonsense. Mom had virtually nothing left, he told Michael and Jessica. This is probably just Rachel's influence, she always had Mom wrapped around her finger. Despite his dismissive attitude, I noticed Gregory watching me speculatively for the remainder of the reception, as if trying to determine what I might know about Eleanor's final arrangements. The week between the funeral and the will reading crawled by in a haze of grief and anxiety. I returned to work, finding solace in helping others while processing my own loss. In quiet moments, I found myself talking to Eleanor, asking for guidance or simply sharing my day as I had when she was alive. What were you planning, Grandma? I whispered one night, staring at her photograph on my bedside table. What did you mean about justice coming in its own time? 2 days before the scheduled reading, I received a call from Jessica. My sister had always been the family peacekeeper, avoiding conflict whenever possible, which had led her to side with our father during the house dispute. I've been thinking about Grandma, she said hesitantly. About how everything happened with the house. Yes, I prompted when she fell silent. Dad always said she was confused, that she wanted him to take over the property. Jessica's voice trembled slightly. But the last time I visited her in that tiny apartment, she seemed so clear. She talked about her garden at the old house, about specific plants and where they were located. She remembered details from decades ago. It didn't seem like someone who was mentally declining. She wasn't declining, I said gently. She was never confused, Jess. Then why would Dad say? She stopped abruptly. Oh. Yeah. Oh. I don't want to believe that, my sister whispered. About our father. I know. I didn't either. After a long silence, Jessica asked, Do you know what's in the will? No idea. Grandma kept her plans private, even from me. Dad's been weird about it. Alternating between saying it doesn't matter because there's nothing of value, and making phone calls to find out if wills can be contested. This didn't surprise me. Gregory had always hedged his bets. Guess we'll find out soon enough, I said. The morning of the will reading dawned bright and clear, the kind of early spring day Eleanor would have loved. As I dressed in the black dress I'd worn to her funeral, I felt a strange combination of dread and anticipation. Whatever Eleanor had planned today would reveal it. Bradley's law offices occupied the top floor of a restored historic building downtown. The conference room where we gathered featured gleaming wood paneling and tall windows overlooking the city. Bradley himself, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, greeted each family member with formal courtesy. Gregory arrived last, accompanied by a man he introduced as Stephen Mercer, his personal attorney. Bradley raised an eyebrow at this but merely nodded and indicated they should take seats at the polished conference table. Is this everyone Mrs. Wilson specified? Bradley asked, consulting a list. I looked around the table. Gregory sat at one end, his expression impatient, Stephen Mercer beside him reviewing documents from a leather portfolio. Diana sat across from them, her back straight, her face composed but strained. Michael and Jessica occupied chairs in the middle, both looking uncomfortable and out of place. I sat nearest to Bradley, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Yes, I confirmed. This is the immediate family. Bradley nodded and placed a thick folder on the table. Before we begin, Mrs. Wilson left instructions that this recording should be played. He pressed a button on a remote control, and a screen descended from the ceiling at the end of the room. After a moment, Eleanor's face appeared, causing my breath to catch. She had recorded this in her final weeks, thin and pale but with clear eyes and a determined set to her mouth. If you're watching this, she began, her voice steady. Then I have passed on. I want to thank you all for honoring my request to gather for this reading. She paused, her gaze seeming to meet each of ours through the screen. Family has always been my greatest treasure, even when it brought my greatest pain. Gregory shifted in his seat, his expression darkening. I lived a life guided by certain principles, Eleanor continued. Honesty, fairness, compassion. I tried to instill these values in my son and later in my grandchildren. Some lessons took root. Others, it seems, did not. Now Gregory was openly scowling, while Diana had gone very still. What will follow today may be difficult for some of you to hear. But truth, however painful, is necessary for healing. And justice, however delayed, is still justice. Eleanor's image leaned slightly forward, her gaze intensifying. I leave you with this thought. True wealth is not measured in property or possessions but in how we treat those who depend on us. Remember that when all is said and done. The screen went dark, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Bradley allowed the moment to stretch before opening his folder. Now, he said, his tone businesslike. Let us proceed with the reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Wilson. Gregory leaned toward his attorney, whispering something that made Mercer nod and make a note on his legal pad. Diana watched them with narrowed eyes. Michael and Jessica exchanged uncertain glances, and I sat waiting, wondering what final act my remarkable grandmother had orchestrated from beyond the grave. Thomas Bradley adjusted his reading glasses and began to read from the formal document before him, his voice clear and measured in the hushed conference room. I, Eleanor Margaret Wilson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. Gregory drummed his fingers impatiently on the table as Bradley worked through the standard legal preamble. His attorney, Mercer, maintained a professional poker face, but I noticed him watching Bradley with the keen attention of one legal mind assessing another. First, Bradley continued, I wish to address the matter of my primary residence, the property located at 1847 Maple Avenue. Gregory's drumming fingers stilled. Diana's gaze flicked to her husband. While this property was transferred to my son, Gregory Wilson, in what appeared to be a legal transaction, I hereby declare that this transfer was executed under conditions of duress and misrepresentation. This is ridiculous, Gregory interrupted, his face flushing. Mom signed those papers willingly. She knew exactly what she was doing. Bradley paused, regarding Gregory over the rim of his glasses. Mr. Wilson, please allow me to complete the reading without interruption. You'll have an opportunity to respond afterward. He returned to the document. I have instructed my legal team to compile evidence of this fraudulent transfer, including but not limited to witness statements regarding verbal misrepresentations made by Gregory Wilson, documentation of my repeated expressions of confusion regarding what I was signing, medical certification of my mental competence at the time of signing, and audio recordings of conversations in which Gregory Wilson admitted to deceiving me about the nature of the documents. The color drained from Gregory's face. He turned to whisper urgently to Mercer, who was now frowning deeply. Furthermore, Bradley continued, unperturbed. Upon discovery of this fraudulent transfer, I engaged legal counsel to quietly pursue remedies. On February 12th of this year, just 3 weeks before my death, a judge ruled in my favor, finding clear evidence of undue influence and misrepresentation. The deed to 1847 Maple Avenue was legally returned to my estate. A collective gasp went around the table. Michael's mouth literally fell open. Jessica pressed a hand to her lips. Diana closed her eyes briefly, as if in prayer or resignation. Gregory shot to his feet. That's impossible. I would have been notified of any legal proceeding. You were, Mr. Wilson, Bradley replied calmly. Notice was served to your office on 3 separate occasions. Your assistant signed for each delivery. Copies of these receipts are included in the supporting documentation. He gestured to a thick folder beside him. When you failed to appear or respond, the court proceeded in your absence. This can't be legal, Gregory insisted, looking to Mercer for support. I'd need to review the documentation, Mercer said cautiously. But if proper notice was served and evidence of fraud presented, the court certainly has authority to void a transfer. Gregory sank back into his chair, his expression stunned. Bradley continued reading. In addition to recovering my property, I have maintained throughout my life a private investment portfolio, managed independently from family knowledge. This portfolio, currently valued at approximately $2.4 million, constitutes the remainder of my estate. Now it was my turn to be shocked. Eleanor had never mentioned any investments of this magnitude. From the expressions around the table, no one else had known either. My estate therefore consists of the property at 1847 Maple Avenue, valued at approximately $1.6 million, and liquid assets of approximately $2.4 million for a total estate value of roughly $4 million. Bradley paused, allowing this information to sink in. Gregory had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the attorney with laser focus. The distribution of my estate shall be as follows, Bradley continued. To my son, Gregory Wilson, I leave the sum of $1. Gregory made a strangled sound. This token bequest reflects not a lack of maternal love, but the reality that Gregory has already taken far more than his share through his business education, which I funded, the multiple loans I provided that were never repaid, and his attempt to appropriate my home through deception. Diana was now staring at her husband with an expression that mingled shock and dawning comprehension. To my daughter-in-law, Diana Wilson, I leave the sum of $50,000, to be held in trust and released only in the event that she establishes financial independence from Gregory. My hope is that this provision might offer her the freedom to make choices based on her own moral compass rather than financial necessity. Diana's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. To my grandson, Michael Wilson, I leave the sum of $100,000, to be held in trust until he completes 1 year of volunteer service with a nonprofit organization serving vulnerable populations. This requirement is designed to broaden his understanding of privilege and responsibility. Michael blinked rapidly, looking both offended and confused. To my granddaughter, Jessica Wilson, I leave the sum of $100,000, to be released when she provides written evidence that she has sought and completed therapy to address her conflict avoidance and tendency to enable harmful family dynamics. Jessica's face crumpled. tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded slightly, acknowledging the painful accuracy of Eleanor's assessment. The remainder of my estate, including the property at 1847, Maple Avenue and approximately $2.15 million in liquid assets, I leave to my granddaughter, Rachel Wilson. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't process what I was hearing. Rachel has demonstrated unwavering integrity, compassion, and courage in standing for what is right, even at great personal cost. She has embodied the values I hold dear and has been my strength when I had none left. I entrust her with this legacy knowing she will use it wisely and compassionately. Tears blurred my vision as Bradley continued. However, I place one condition on this bequest. Rachel may not retain the house at 1847, Maple Avenue for her personal use. The property must be sold within 1 year of my death, with proceeds to be used as Rachel sees fit. My home was my joy for many years, but in the end it became a source of division and pain. I do not wish for Rachel to live with that shadow. Better to release the physical structure and carry forward the values it once housed. A strange calm settled over me as I heard these words. It was so perfectly Eleanor. Practical yet profound, acknowledging pain while focusing on healing. Finally, Bradley read, I have established a foundation to be called the Eleanor Justice Project, with initial funding of $500,000 from my estate. This foundation will provide legal assistance to elderly individuals facing financial exploitation or abuse, particularly from family members. Rachel Wilson will serve as the foundation's first director should she choose to accept this responsibility. Bradley looked up from the document. The remainder of the will addresses technical and legal matters regarding executorship, which has been assigned to my firm, and various administrative details. Does anyone have questions about the provisions I've read? The silence was absolute. Gregory sat rigid, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Mercer was scribbling notes rapidly. Diana studied her hands, which trembled slightly. Michael looked shell-shocked. Jessica continued to cry quietly. And I felt overwhelmed, not just by the unexpected inheritance, but by the profound trust Eleanor had placed in me and the responsibility that came with it. Gregory finally broke the silence, his voice dangerously controlled. I'll be contesting this will. It's clearly the product of undue influence. He looked directly at me. Rachel manipulated our mother in her vulnerable final months. Bradley seemed unperturbed by this threat. You're certainly entitled to contest, Mr. Wilson. However, Mrs. Eleanor anticipated this possibility. He extracted another document from his folder. Your mother underwent comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluation by 3 independent experts just 2 weeks before finalizing this will. All 3 certified her as fully competent and free from any undue influence. Additionally, our firm took the unusual step of videotaping the will preparation and signing process, with your mother explicitly stating her reasons for each provision and confirming she was acting of her own free will. Gregory's attorney placed a restraining hand on his client's arm. We should discuss this privately, Gregory. Furthermore, Bradley continued, Mrs. Wilson compiled extensive documentation of your financial dealings with her over the past 20 years, including undocumented loans totaling over $300,000, which you repeatedly promised to repay but never did. There is also documentation of your gambling debts, business failures, and the specific timeline of your campaign to acquire her home. Contesting the will would make all of this information part of the public record. The threat was clear. Gregory would not only lose but would be publicly exposed. This meeting is over, Gregory snapped, standing abruptly. Come on, Diana. Diana remained seated. I'll find my own way home, she said quietly. Gregory stared at her in disbelief before storming out, Mercer hurrying after him. In the silence that followed, Bradley began organizing his papers. The formal documentation will be provided to each of you. Rachel, as primary beneficiary, I'll need you to stay a bit longer to discuss next steps. Michael stood awkwardly. I should go. He paused, looking at me uncertainly. Rachel, I didn't know. About Dad and Grandma. I should have listened to you. We all should have, Jessica added, wiping her tears. I'm so sorry. Rachel. Diana approached me last, her composure cracking. I failed her, she said simply. I failed you both. Grandma believed in second chances, I replied, surprising myself with the lack of bitterness in my voice. That's why she left you a path forward. After they left, Bradley explained the details of my inheritance and the process ahead. The house would need to be sold, the foundation established, funds transferred. It was overwhelming, but he assured me his firm would guide me through each step. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, he told me as we concluded. In all my years of practice, I've rarely seen someone respond to betrayal with such measured justice. She wanted consequences. Yes, but also opportunity for redemption where possible. She spoke of you often and with great pride. I still can't believe she managed all this while so ill, I said. Bradley smiled slightly. Mrs. Wilson began consulting me the very day after she discovered the true nature of the documents she'd signed. She was determined from the start to rectify the situation. The storm and her displacement only strengthened her resolve. I left Bradley's office in a daze, walking aimlessly through downtown streets as I processed everything. Eleanor had not only secured justice for herself but had created a legacy that would help others. She had seen through Gregory's deception and countered it not with matching vindictiveness but with clear-eyed accountability. And she had trusted me to carry her work forward. In the year that followed, Eleanor's plan unfolded just as she had designed. I sold the house to a preservationist couple, who promised to restore its historical features rather than modernize. The proceeds, combined with my inherited funds, allowed me to establish the Eleanor Justice Project as a significant force in elder advocacy. Gregory contested the will despite Bradley's warnings but withdrew his petition when faced with the mountain of evidence Eleanor had accumulated. His business continued to struggle. And 6 months after the will reading, Diana filed for divorce. She later joined a law practice specializing in elder rights and occasionally consulted with our foundation. Michael fulfilled his grandmother's requirement by volunteering with a homeless outreach program, an experience that profoundly changed his perspective. Jessica pursued therapy and gradually developed a stronger voice in both her personal and professional life. Slowly, painfully, our fractured family began to heal, not back to what it had been, but into something new and perhaps more authentic. I chose not to live in excessive luxury despite my newfound wealth. Instead, I purchased a modest but comfortable home and invested most of the inheritance in expanding the foundation's work. Eleanor's final gift had given me not just financial security but purpose, a way to transform her personal injustice into protection for others. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, I visited her grave with a bouquet of her favorite gardenias. As I stood there, I felt a profound sense of her presence and wisdom. "You were right, Grandma," I said softly to the spring breeze. "Justice does come in its own time." And in that moment, I understood that Eleanor's greatest legacy wasn't the money or even the foundation, but the lesson she had taught us all. That true inheritance isn't measured in property or possessions, but in the values we choose to live by and the courage to stand for what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. Have you ever witnessed someone in your family standing up for what's right, even when it was hard? Or have you had to be that person yourself? Share your story in the comments below. And if Eleanor's journey taught you something valuable today, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more stories of justice and resilience. And share this with someone who might need to hear that sometimes, even when it seems impossible, justice does find its way in the end. Thank you for listening to Eleanor's story and mine.